last talk. Let's go. So what's in a button? I'm going to be talking about the engineering that goes into building components for user interfaces on the web. So what does this mean? Okay, let's start off with how designers and developers would typically work together to build an app. Designers come up with designs of what the app would look like and how it should be used. And developers implement these designs using code and build the final app. So here we have 3 views of 3 different apps at Google. Usually designers would want their designs to look consistent across different views of the same app, or in Google's case, across different apps of the same brand. And so you see how even though these views are very different, they have the same style and feel because parts of it look similar. Like you have the circular button in all 3 of these views. You have this bottom panel that slides up, and then you also have like these rectangular boxes that define boundaries. So let's say you have like 100 of these circular buttons in your app's designs. You don't want to be rewriting that code over and over again. And this is where components come in. So when I talk about components in this talk, I'm referring to the widgets that can be reused to build interfaces. So the buttons or the text fields or the bottom panel or list items. And in engineering or in code, I'm talking specifically about the code that makes this button reusable in the code base. So this is what I do. I work on a team at Google called Material Design, and our team is composed of designers that write guidelines for how to design these components, as well as engineers who implement them on iOS, Android, and web. And I'm one of the ones that work on the web team, and I'll take you through what it's like to build a component. And there might be a lot of code in this talk, so brace yourselves. Cool, let's make a button. So for now, we'll forget about making this like a reusable component. Just build a button to look like this, and then we'll talk about making it reusable in a bit. So let's say that we're working at a company and we're working with a designer on our team called Maria. And she designed a button that looks like this on the top right. And she also gave us a list of design requirements for how the button should look like and how it should look when you interact with it. So the text and the border should be purple, and then also when you hover over it, the background color should change to light purple, and when you focus on it, the background color should change to medium purple. So this is what the designer gives us. Now let's get to coding. So if you've ever created a button before, you know that the first thing is create the HTML, so button tags, some text in the middle, bam, that's what it should look like at this point. But Maria said that she wants a purple button, so let's add some CSS, change the color and the border, and then now we have a button that looks like this. And she also said that she wants the button color to change when you hover or focus on it. So we're going to be using what's called pseudo classes in CSS. And what this essentially says is when the button is hovered, style it like this, and when the button is focused, style it like this. So here is all of the code that we've written so far. And keep in mind that at this point, still there's nothing to do with building reusable components. We're just building a button according to Maria's guidelines. Ta-da! We have a button, and it looks just like what Maria required, but we know that Maria is probably going to want to put this same button on like 20 other pages in our web app to make it look consistent. And if we didn't have a reusable component, we'd have to rewrite this code like 20 more times. So let's make it a component. And then we'd only have to write the component code one time and then reuse it for all the other 20 times. So back to the code that we have so far, one way of turning this into a reusable component is by creating a new class with the name of our component, which we'll just call button-component. So we can add that class to the HTML and then replace all the CSS button selectors with our new class, button-component. And now we've created a button component. So the next question is naturally, how do we use it to create our other 20 buttons? So let's say that we want to create another button called My Other Button. Then we can just add the button-component class to the HTML of this new button, and it'll automatically be styled with all of the CSS that we wrote before. So we don't need that anymore. And this makes our code look a lot cleaner, less redundant. And this button-component class is considered the API of our component, and it basically packages up all of the reusable code that we've written, in this case the CSS, for other developers or for future you to use when they want to create more buttons. And here it is. So quick note, a class refers to a programming paradigm that packages up code to be reused later. So like a class here or a class in like object-oriented programming. Whereas a component is referring to the reusable code specifically used to build part of the UI. And so you would use classes to implement a component. OK, so let's say that Maria comes back to us with a design for a form on our app that has like 2 buttons and like 8 text fields. And that's a lot of text fields that all look the same. So let's make it a text field component. And Marie wants her text field to look like this. And spoiler, it will require JavaScript. So that's what makes it more complex. OK, design requirements. Text, purple, border, purple. And then she has these 2 other requirements, which is that when you focus on the input, the label should float to the top right. And when you blur or stop focusing on the input, the label should go back to its resting position unless the input is filled. So let's start with the HTML. For a text field, you need to have an input and a label. And at this point, our text field should look like that. But remember that we're building a text field component, not just a text field. So let's wrap our input and label with a div and then give it a class for our component name, text-field-component. And still, our text field should look like that. OK, so onto the CSS. This is a lot of code, but essentially it's just styling the initial position of the text field to make it look like what you have on the top right. And really, the code doesn't matter that much, but we'll just walk through it real quick. So these lines style the color, the font, and the border. Here's some width and height adjustments. And then this is what positions the name label over the input element in the text field so that you have this resting position for the text field. OK, so here's all of the code that we've written for text fields so far. I collapsed the CSS because that's not important. And we've taken the exact same steps as we did to create our button component so far. And it looks pretty good, but it doesn't do anything when we click on it. And this is what we want it to look like. So we'll be making this happen using CSS animations, or in our case, transitions and JavaScript. OK, so what we want is a class that we can style similar to how we styled the hover and focus pseudo classes for our button. But there's no pseudo class that's like your input is focused right now and your label should be floating. So we're going to make up that class ourselves, and then we'll add it to the text field element using JavaScript when the input is focused, and then remove it from the text field when the input is blurred. So we're essentially doing all the work of a pseudo class ourselves in JavaScript. OK, so let's style the text field when the label is floating. So pretend that this floating-label class has already been added to our label element in HTML. And then we'll actually add it later. But for now, just pretend it's there so that we can style it using CSS. So this is where CSS transitions comes in. In the floating-label class selector, we'll set the CSS transform property to shrink the label and position it just above the input so that it looks like this. So this is when the text field is clicked on or the input is focused. And then just to be fancy, we'll also set the CSS transition property on the label element, and this line of code at the bottom just makes the animation really nice and smooth. And don't worry about the specific values here. I just wanted to show you the code for it. Okay, great. So now we have two versions of the text field, one that has the floating label element and one that doesn't. But we actually haven't added the floating dash label class to the HTML yet. And what we want is to be able to switch between these two versions of the text field. So this is where JavaScript comes in. Okay, there's 3 steps to the JavaScript. Step 1 is just the setup, just select the HTML elements so that we can access it in our JavaScript. Step 2 is tell it that when the input is focused, add the floating dash label class. Step 3 is when it's blurred, remove the floating dash label class. So step 1, this is just setting up the JavaScript to access our HTML elements. So we can first select the overall text field wrapper element, and then select the input and label sub-elements from that, so that we have 3 variables that we can work with in our JavaScript. Step 2, this is where the magic happens. We're going to add an event listener that essentially says, when I focus on the input element, add the floating dash label class to my label element. And then step 3 is pretty much the same thing, but for blurring, we'll add another event listener that says, when I blur the input, remove the floating label class from the label. And you can see there's one caveat here, which is that we only want to remove the floating dash label class if the input is empty. So otherwise, we'll end up with a situation like this, where the label will move back into its resting position over our text that the user has inputted. So we just add a simple condition. And then this is what you get. We have our fully animating text field. But remember, at this point, the JavaScript controller, like all the JavaScript that we've written, is not actually part of the component yet because it's not really reusable. So what we need to do is to package up our JavaScript similar to how we packaged up our CSS for the button component. Otherwise, we'll have to rewrite our JavaScript for every text field. So the way we do that is to put all of our JavaScript code into a JavaScript class, which we'll call text field component. And the only thing that we leave out is the selector for that very top level div wrapper. And this is so that if we have a bunch of text fields in our HTML, each one of them can have their own JavaScript controller. So here's all of our text field component code right now. And the parts here are the parts that make it a reusable component as opposed to a regular text field. And so this is the API of the text field component, since it's how you or other developers would use to create more text fields in the future. So how do I create a new text field using the component? So say you have another text field called myOtherTextField that you want to add. And so you just need to add the text-field-component class to the top level div, and then instantiate that in JavaScript using your JavaScript component class text field component. And then that's it. You should have a new text field that looks just like this. And you didn't have to write any of the CSS animation or label positioning or event handling, because that's already done previously in your component code. So just to wrap up, here are the 2 components that we made. And these are a simplified version of the components that my team builds on material design. Here are some examples of the components that my team has built. And Material Components is completely open source, and you can find our repo on GitHub and contribute to it if you want. So just kind of like take a look and think, like, how would I make each one of these components using like CSS and JavaScript and HTML? So I wanted to give this talk to showcase that building UI could be really cool and come with really interesting engineering challenges. Back when I was on a different team at Google and looking for like a new team to switch onto, I came across material design, I was kind of like, how hard is it to like build a button or a text field? And I completely underestimated the amount of like architectural decision that goes into building something as simple as a text field or a checkbox or a slider. And also being on this team made me appreciate design. I now can like just look at all the subtle animations or the subtle movements of each piece of the component and kind of like think about how would I build that. So if you're into like design and development, then UI engineering is a pretty cool way to kind of be part of both. So thanks. Here are the links for our component library and our GitHub repo.